This was done, and early the following morning, when the whole palace was wrapped up in sleep, she stole up onto the roof where the prince was already waiting for her, with his horse's head turned towards Persia. He mounted first and helped the princess up behind. Then, when she was firmly seated, with her hands holding tightly to his belt, he touched the screw and the horse began to leave the earth quickly behind him. He travelled with his accustomed speed, and Prince Firuz Shah guided him so well that in 2 hours and a half from the time of starting, he saw the capital of Persia lying beneath him. He was determined to alight neither in the great square from which he had started, nor in the Sultan's palace, but at a country house a little distance from the town. Here he showed the princess a beautiful suite of rooms, and begged her to rest, while he informed his father of their arrival and prepared a reception worthy of her rank. Then he ordered a horse to be saddled and set out. All the way through the streets he was welcomed with shouts of joy by the people, who had long lost hope of seeing him again. On reaching the palace he found the Sultan surrounded by his ministers, all clad in the deepest mourning, and his father almost went out of his mind with surprise and delight at the mere sound of his son's voice. When he had calmed down a little, he begged the prince to relate his adventures. The prince at once seized the opening thus given him, and told the whole story of his treatment by the Princess of Bengal, not even concealing the fact that she had fallen in love with him. "And sire," he added, "having given my royal word that you would not refuse your consent to our marriage, I persuaded her to return with me on the Indian's horse. I have left her in one of your highness's country houses, where she is waiting anxiously to be assured that I have not promised in vain." As he said this, the prince was about to throw himself at the feet of the Sultan, but his father prevented him, and embracing him again, said eagerly, "My son, not only do I gladly consent to your marriage with the Princess of Bengal, but I will hasten to pay my respects to her and thank her in my own person for the benefits she has conferred on you. I will then bring her back with me and make all the arrangements for the wedding to be celebrated today." So the Sultan gave orders that the mourning worn by the people should be thrown off, and there should be a concert of drums, trumpets, and cymbals. Also that the Indian should be taken from prison and brought before him. His commands were obeyed, and the Indian was led into his presence, surrounded by guards. "I have kept you locked up," said the Sultan, "in case my son was lost, that your life should pay the penalty. He has now returned, so take your horse and be gone forever." The Indian hastily quitted the presence of the Sultan, and when he was outside he inquired of the man who had taken him out of prison where the prince had really been all this time, and what he had been doing. They told him the whole story, and how the Princess of Bengal was even then waiting in the country palace the consent of the Sultan, which at once put in the Indian's head a plan of revenge for the treatment he had received. Going straight to the country house, he informed the doorkeeper who was left in charge that he had been sent by the Sultan and the Prince of Persia to bring the princess and the enchanted horse to the palace. The doorkeeper knew the man by sight, and was of course aware that nearly 3 months before he had been thrown into prison by the Sultan. Seeing him at liberty, the man took for granted that he was speaking the truth, and made no difficulty about leading him before the Princess of Bengal, while on her side, hearing he had come from the prince, the lady gladly consented to do what he wished. The Indian, delighted with the success of his scheme, mounted the horse, assisted the princess to mount behind him, and turned the peg at the very moment the prince was leaving the palace in Shiraz for the country house, followed closely by the Sultan and all the court. Knowing this, the Indian deliberately steered the horse above the city, in order that his revenge for his unjust imprisonment might be all the quicker and sweeter. When the Sultan of Persia saw the horse and its riders, he stopped short in astonishment and horror, and broke out into oaths, which the Indian heard quite unmoved, knowing he was perfectly safe from pursuit. But mortified and furious as the Sultan was, his feelings were nothing to those of Prince Firuz Shah on seeing the object of his passionate devotion being borne rapidly away. And while he was struck speechless with grief and remorse at not having guarded her better, she vanished swiftly out of his sight. What was he to do? Should he follow his father into the palace and there give up to his despair? Both his love and his courage forbade it, and he continued his way to the country house. The sight of the prince showed the doorkeeper of what folly he had been guilty, and flinging himself at his master's feet, he implored his pardon. "Rise," said the prince. "I am the cause of this misfortune, not you. Go find me the dress of a dervish, but beware of saying it is for me." At a short distance from the country house, a convent of dervishes was situated, and the superior, or sheikh, was the doorkeeper's friend. It was easy enough to obtain a dervish's dress, which the prince put on at once instead of his own. Disguised like this, and concealing about him a box of pearls and diamonds he had intended as a present to the princess, he left the house at nightfall, uncertain where he should go, but firmly resolved not to return without her. Meanwhile, the Indian had turned the horse in such different direction that, before many hours had passed, it had entered a wood close to the capital of the kingdom of Kashmir. Feeling very hungry, and supposing that the princess might also be in want of food, he brought his steed down to earth, and left the princess in a shady place on the banks of a clear stream. At first, when the princess found herself alone, the idea occurred to her of trying to escape and hide herself. But as she had scarcely eaten anything since she had left Bengal, she felt too weak to venture far, and was obliged to abandon her design. On the return of the Indian with meats of various kinds, she began to eat voraciously, and soon had regained sufficient courage to reply with spirit to his insolent remarks. Goaded by his threats, she sprang to her feet, calling loudly for help, and luckily her cries were heard by a troop of horsemen, who rode up to inquire what was the matter. Now the leader of these horsemen was the Sultan of Kashmir, returning from the chase, and he instantly turned to the Indian to inquire who he was, and who was the lady he had with him. The Indian rudely answered that it was his wife, and there was no occasion for anyone else to interfere between them. The princess, who of course was ignorant of the rank of her deliverer, denied altogether the Indian's story. "My lord," she replied, "whomever you may be, put no faith in this impostor. He is an abominable magician, who has this day torn me from the Prince of Persia, my destined husband, and has brought me here on this enchanted horse." She would have continued, but her tears choked her, and the Sultan of Kashmir, convinced by her beauty and her distinguished air of the truth of her tale, ordered his followers to cut off the Indian's head, which was done immediately. But rescued though she was from one peril, it seemed she had fallen only into another. The Sultan commanded a horse to be given her, and conducted her to his own palace, where he led her to a beautiful apartment, selected female slaves to wait on her, and eunuchs to be her guard. Then, without allowing her time to thank him for all he had done, he bade her repose, saying she should tell him her adventures the following day. The princess fell asleep, flattering herself that she need only relate her story for the Sultan to be touched by compassion and restore her to the prince without delay. But a few hours were to undeceive her. When the Sultan of Kashmir had quitted her presence the evening before, he resolved that the sun should not set again without the princess becoming his wife. At daybreak, proclamations of his intention were made throughout the town by the sound of drums, trumpets, cymbals, and other instruments calculated to fill the heart with joy. The Princess of Bengal was early awakened by the noise, but she did not for one moment imagine it had anything to do with her, till the Sultan, arriving as soon as she was dressed to inquire after her health, informed her that the trumpet blasts she heard were part of the solemn marriage ceremonies, for which he begged her to prepare. This unexpected announcement caused the princess such terror that she sank down in a dead faint. The slaves that were in waiting ran to her aid, and the Sultan himself did his best to bring her back to consciousness, but for a long while it was all to no purpose. At length her senses began to return slowly, and then, rather than break faith with the Prince of Persia by consenting to such a marriage, she determined to feign madness. So she began by saying all sorts of absurdities and using all sorts of strange gestures, while the Sultan stood watching her with sorrow and surprise. But as the sudden seizure showed no signs of abating, he left her to her women, ordering them to take the greatest care of her. Still, as the day went on, the malady seemed to become worse, and by night it was almost violent. Days passed in this manner, till at last the Sultan decided to summon all the doctors of his court to consult together over her sad state. Their answer was that the madness is of so many different kinds it was impossible to give an opinion on the case without seeing the princess. So the Sultan gave orders they were to be introduced into her chamber one by one, every man according to his rank. This decision had been foreseen by the princess, who knew quite well that once she allowed the physicians to feel her pulse, the most ignorant of them would discover that she was in perfectly good health and her madness was feigned. So as each man approached, she broke out into such violent paroxysms that not one dare lay a finger on her. A few, who pretended to be cleverer than the rest, declared that they could diagnose sick people without seeing them, and ordered her certain potions, which she made no difficulty about taking, as she was persuaded they were all harmless. When the Sultan of Kashmir saw that the court doctors could do nothing toward curing the princess, he called in those of the city, who fared no better. Then he had recourse to the most celebrated physicians in the other large towns, but finding the task was beyond their science, he finally sent messengers into the neighbouring states, with a memorandum containing full particulars of the princess's madness, offering at the same time to pay the expenses of any physician who would come and see her for himself, and a handsome reward to one who should cure her. In answer to this proclamation, many foreign professors flocked into Kashmir, but they naturally were not more successful than the rest had been, as the cure depended neither on them nor their skill, but only on the princess herself. It was during this time that Prince Firuz Shah, wandering sadly and hopelessly from place to place, arrived in a large city of India, where he heard a great deal of talk about the Princess of Bengal, who had gone out of her senses on the very day that she should have been married to the Sultan of Kashmir. This was quite enough to induce him to take the road to Kashmir, and to inquire the full particulars of the story at the first inn at which he lodged in the capital. When he knew that he had at last found the princess whom he had so long lost, he set about devising a plan for her rescue. The first thing he did was to procure a doctor's robe, that his dress, added to the long beard he had allowed to grow on his travels, might unmistakably proclaim his profession. He then lost no time in going to the palace, where he obtained an audience of the chief usher, and while apologizing for his boldness in presuming to think he could cure the princess where so many others had failed, declared he had the secret of certain remedies which had hitherto never failed of their effect. The chief usher assured him that he was heartily welcome, and the Sultan would receive him with pleasure, and in case of success he would gain a magnificent reward. When the Prince of Persia, in the disguise of a physician, was brought before him, the Sultan wasted no time in talking, beyond remarking that the mere sight of a doctor threw the princess into transports of rage. He then led the prince up to a room under the roof, which had an opening through which he might observe the princess without himself being seen. The prince looked and beheld the princess reclining on a sofa, with tears in her eyes, singing softly to herself a song bewailing her sad destiny which had deprived her, perhaps forever, of a being she so tenderly loved. The young man's heart beat faster as he listened, for he needed no further proof that her madness was feigned, and that it was a love of him which had caused her to resort to this trick. He softly left his hiding place and returned to the Sultan, to whom he reported he was sure from certain signs of the princess's malady that it was not incurable, but he must see her and speak with her alone. The Sultan made no difficulty in consenting to this, and commanded that he should be ushered into the princess's apartment. The moment she caught sight of his physician's robe, she sprang from her seat in a fury, and heaped insults upon him. The prince took no notice of her behaviour, and, approaching quite close so his words might be heard by her alone, he said in a low whisper, "Look at me, princess, and you will see that I am no doctor but the Prince of Persia, who has come to set you free." At the sound of his voice, the Princess of Bengal suddenly grew calm, and an expression of joy overspread her face, such as comes only when what we wish for most and expect the least suddenly happens to us. For some time she was too enchanted to speak, and Prince Firuz Shah took advantage of her silence to explain to her all that had occurred. His despair at watching her disappear before his very eyes, the oath that he had sworn to follow her all over the world, and his rapture at finally discovering her in a palace in Kashmir. When he had finished, he begged in his turn that the princess would tell him how she had come here, so that he might the better devise some means of rescuing her from the tyranny of the Sultan. It needed but few words from the princess to make him acquainted with the whole situation, and how she had been forced to play the part of a madwoman in order to escape from a marriage with the Sultan, who had not sufficient politeness even to ask her consent. If necessary, she added, she had resolved to die sooner than permit herself to be forced into such a union, and so break faith with the prince she loved. The prince then inquired as if she knew what had become of the enchanted horse since the Indian's death, but the princess could only reply that she had heard nothing about it. Still, she did not suppose that the horse could have been forgotten by the Sultan after all she had told him of the value. To this the prince agreed, and they consulted together over a plan by which she might be able to make her escape and return with him into Persia. At the first step, she was to dress herself with care and receive the Sultan with civility when he visited her the next morning. The Sultan was transported with delight on learning the result of the interview, and his opinion of the doctor's skill was raised higher still when, on the following day, the princess behaved towards him in such a way as to persuade him her complete cure would not be long delayed. However, he contented himself with assuring her how happy he was to see her health so much improved, and exhorted her to make use of every use of so clever a physician, and to repose entire confidence in him. Then he retired, without awaiting any reply from the princess. The Prince of Persia left the room at the same time, and asked if he might be allowed humbly to inquire by what means the Princess of Bengal had reached Kashmir, which was so far distant from her father's kingdom, and how she came to be there alone. The Sultan thought the question very natural, and related the same story the Princess of Bengal had told him, adding that he had ordered the enchanted horse to be taken to his treasury as a curiosity, though he was quite ignorant how it could be used. "Sire," replied the physician, "your Highness's tale has supplied me with the clue I need to complete the recovery of the princess. During her voyage hither on an enchanted horse, a portion of its enchantment has by some means been communicated to her person, and it can only be dissipated by certain perfumes of which I possess the secret. If your Highness will deign to consent and give the court and the people one of the most astonishing spectacles they have ever witnessed, command the horse to be brought to me into the big square outside the palace, and leave the rest to me. I promise that in a very few moments, in the presence of all the assembled multitude, you shall see the princess as healthy both in mind and body as she ever was in her life. And in order to make the spectacle as impressive as possible, I would suggest that she be richly dressed and covered with the noblest jewels of the crown." The Sultan readily agreed to all the prince proposed, and the following morning he desired that the enchanted horse should be taken from the treasury and brought into the great square of the palace. Soon the rumour began to spread through the town that something extraordinary was about to happen, and such a crowd began to collect that the guards had to be called to keep order and make way for the enchanted horse. When all was ready, the Sultan appeared and took his place on a platform, surrounded by the chief nobles and officers of his court. When they were seated, the Princess of Bengal was seen leaving the palace, accompanied by the ladies who had been assigned to her by the Sultan. She slowly approached the enchanted horse, and, with the help of her ladies, mounted on its back. Directly she was in the saddle, with her feet in the stirrups and the bridle in her hand, the physician placed around the horse some large braziers full of burning coals, into each of which he threw a perfume composed of all sorts of delicious scents. Then he crossed his hands over his breast, and with lowered eyes walked 3 times around the horse, muttering certain words. Soon there arose from the burning braziers a thick smoke, which almost concealed both horse and princess. This was the moment for which the prince had been waiting. Springing lightly up behind the lady, he leaned forwards and turned the peg, and just as the horse darted up into the air, he cried aloud so that his words were heard by all present. "Sultan of Kashmir, when you wish to marry princesses who have sought your protection, learn first to gain their consent." It was in this way that the Prince of Persia rescued the Princess of Bengal, and returned with her to Persia, where they descended this time before the palace of the king himself. The marriage was only delayed long enough to make the ceremony as brilliant as possible, and as soon as the rejoicings were over, an ambassador was sent to the King of Bengal to inform him of what had passed, and to ask his approbation of the alliance between the 2 countries, which he heartily gave. See you next time.